So I don't know how many of you have actually read Carlos Castaneda. I've done some polls of people I know. To my surprise, some of the people around my age have read him. Most of the people that I know and have talked to have heard of Castaneda but never read any of it, so they don't really know anything about it. So what's the story here? So Carlos Castaneda was a young anthropology student. I don't know much more about his background. He apparently was studying anthropology at UCLA, and he decided to do his work on doing sort of field studies. And basically, he ended up apprenticing with a person in Mexico who was considered one of the leading or foremost, and here it's tricky with the words. Some people would say shaman. The other words they use are a man of knowledge or a shaman, or there's a whole lot of different words, but you could say a man of knowledge or a sorcerer. They use different words at different times. And so essentially what this was the depiction, the description, the analysis of of Castaneda's decades-long apprenticeship with the sorcerer who was named Don Juan Matus. I think Don Juan may be a doctor sort of moniker or something. I'm not sure what you call that. But anyways, Don Juan Matus is essentially what he's called. Now, I also want to be clear that after I read this, and I remember this even going back 35, 40 years ago, there was a lot of talk that none of this actually happened, that Castaneda essentially made this up. There was no Don Juan Matus. There was no apprenticeship. He just kind of made this stuff up and wrote about it as if he was real. And I would say that is maybe even at this point the consensus as to what actually happened. I would contend that while it certainly makes the story more compelling and in some ways more interesting if it was, quote, real, in other words, if he did have a real apprenticeship with Don Juan Matus, but some of the passages or the insights or the stories that he gives, I think can stand alone. Somebody made this up. Somebody thought of this. Somebody told this story, whether it was just out of Castaneda's imagination or his own musings, or whether it was from the teachings of Don Juan Matus. I don't think I know, and I'm not sure that it actually matters. What I'll talk a little about today is appropriately called a separate reality. And one of the benefits of these books are we have Castaneda plays the role of the "are you kidding" kind of guy. And so Don Juan will say things or show him things, and Castaneda just can't hardly believe his eyes. Similarly, if I was hearing this or seeing this, or probably most of us, you can hardly believe what you're hearing or seeing. And so we're really talking about a separate reality. We're talking about is there something with our minds that is trapped in what we think is the only reality, but Don Juan is showing him a separate reality, which, as I say, may be even more real, or it may be at least separately real. And more importantly, unless we become familiar with that separate reality, it will prevent us from growing and healing in the way that we all think we want to do. So I think I'll let that stand as an introduction and then just get into actually reading some of the stories and then giving my little interpretation of it. And I appreciate that this is a little bit out of context. I hope at least some of you are moved to actually look into the whole Castaneda series. So this passage comes from page 87 in the book A Separate Reality, otherwise subtitle Conversations with Don Juan. So he's having a conversation with Don Juan, and they come to a point about questioning, do things matter? And I think most of us looking at that question or trying to answer would think it's ridiculous. And in fact, a lot of the things that they talk about on first blush, we would say that's a ridiculous question. Of course things matter. Of course it matters whether you take the shot or don't take the shot, or eat good food or don't eat good food, or look for the truth or don't look for the truth, or believe in this nonsense or that truth, or whatever it is. So that's what he's dealing with. The question, do things matter? So let me just read. To illustrate my point, I told Don Juan the story of an old man of my culture, a very wealthy conservative lawyer, who lived his life convinced that he upheld the truth. In the early 30s, with the advent of the New Deal, he found himself passionately involved in the political drama of that time. He was categorically sure that change was deleterious to the country, and out of devotion to this way of life and the conviction that he was right, he vowed to fight what he thought to be a political evil. But the tide of the time was too strong, it overpowered him. He struggled for 10 years against it in the political arena and in the realm of his personal life. Then the Second World War sealed his efforts into total defeat. His political and ideological downfall resulted in profound bitterness. He became a self-exile for 25 years. When I met him, he was 84 years old and had come back to his hometown to spend his last years in his home for the aged. It seemed inconceivable to me that he had lived that long, considering the way he had squandered his life in bitterness and self-pity. Somehow he found my company amenable, and we used to talk at great length. So here is Castaneda relating the story of somebody that he had multiple conversations with. And again, we don't know if this is true or just a story he's making up. And again, I would submit that doesn't actually matter. Okay, he said, I told Don Juan that my conflict arose from the doubts into which his words about controlled folly had thrown me. Again, this is Castaneda. If nothing really matters, I said, upon becoming a man of knowledge, that's another word for a sorcerer, which is what Castaneda was trying to become by apprenticing with Don Juan. One would find oneself perforce as empty as my friend and in no better position. In other words, he's saying, if nothing matters, which is what Don Juan had told him, then wouldn't you find yourself empty and bereft, just like his friend who had found himself empty and bereft because the thing he cared about the most turned out he was defeated? That's not so, Don Juan said cuttingly. Your friend is lonely because he will die without seeing. Seeing is essentially the goal, you could say. I don't know if goal is not the right word, of what Don Juan was trying to teach Castaneda. Teach is also the wrong word. In his life, he just grew old, and now he must have more self-pity than ever before. He feels he threw away 40 years because he was after victories and found only defeats. He'll never know that to be victorious and to be defeated are equal. So now you're afraid of me because I told you that you're equal to everything else. You're being childish. Our lot as men is to learn, and one goes to knowledge as one goes to war. I have told you this countless times. One goes to knowledge or to war with fear, with respect, aware that one is going to war, and with absolute confidence in oneself. Put your trust in yourself, not in me. And so you're afraid of the emptiness of your friend's life. But there's no emptiness in the life of a man of knowledge. I tell you, everything is filled to the brim. Don Juan stood and extended his arms as if feeling things in the air. Everything is filled to the brim, he repeated, and everything is equal. I'm not like your friend who just grew old. When I tell you that nothing matters, I don't mean it the way he does. For him, his struggle was not worth his while, because he was defeated. For me, there is no victory or defeat or emptiness. Everything is filled to the brim, and everything is equal, and my struggle was worth my while. So what is he saying here? He's saying that when you become a man of knowledge, a sorcerer, a wizard, a shaman, that you give up the quest for being victorious, nor do you care if you're defeated. Now, I think we all need to think about that. We all have this quest of convincing people there's no virus, convincing people there is a virus, convincing people there's no cells, convincing people there's no chemicals, convincing people we're all electromagnetic fields, convincing people that we're all physical substance and there's no consciousness or mind or spirit, or whatever it is that we want to convince people and make other people believe. What Don Juan seems to be saying is, I don't care about things like that. I am simply going after the pursuit of knowledge, i.e. the truth, wherever it may lead. Victories or defeats or what other people will think or say or do about it has no bearing on my quest. And if I give up the misconception, the illusion that I can somehow either be victorious or I'm defeated, I will be filled to the brim and I will have a life that's full of more meaning and more wisdom and more revelations than anything you could possibly imagine. And I think it's worthwhile pondering for all of us, is there anything in our life that's like that? Do we hang on to and actually judge our self-worth based on whether we have convinced this person or this person we've been defeated by, or whatever it may be? We judge ourselves by our victories or defeats. We pretend that those things matter. And I think that's what he means by saying none of that matters. All that matters is the quest for the truth, which interestingly, he says, one should approach with fear and with courage and with insight and knowledge as best one can. And you simply do it for the fact that you have this idea, which you can't even prove, that simply searching for the truth by this process of discarding that which isn't true will eventually get you to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which may be actually at the place you started in the beginning. And even maybe there's no pot of rainbow at all, or pot of gold at the end of the rainbow at all, and you simply end up with a life where you're filled to the brim and more alive than you can ever imagine. And the question is part of this aloneness and deadness and disease that we feel because we keep clinging to these things which we believe matter, which in reality just get us off the proper track. So that was one story. Let's go to another story, which I think has even more relevance to this process of healing. So now I'm on the same book, A Separate Reality, page 138. And here they are further into Castaneda's quest to become a man of knowledge, a sorcerer, a shaman, or somebody who can heal like Don Juan. And even after decades of trying, he just cannot quite somehow make that transition to become a true person of healing. So they have the following encounter, which I will read. This, I believe, happened after some sort of a hallucinogenic, I'm not sure which one. And Don Juan says, I see. And by the way, when he used the word see, that's a very specific word in these Castaneda books. See doesn't have an actual translation that I can use, or that he uses. A lot of even the wording and the concepts are a little bit obscure, but he's using the word seeing not to simply look with your eyes, but to actually perceive the reality. That's what he's talking about. So it starts. I see a little boy crying, Don Juan said after a pause. He repeated it various times as if I did not understand. I had the feeling he was talking about me as a little boy crying, so I really did not pay attention to it. Hey, he said, demanding my full concentration. I see a little boy crying. I asked him if that boy was me. He said no. Then I asked him if it was a vision of my life or just a memory of his own life. He did not answer. I see a little boy crying, he continued saying, and he is crying and crying. Is he a boy I know? I asked. Yes. Is he my little boy? No. Is he crying now? He's crying now, he said with conviction. I thought Don Juan was having a vision of someone I knew who was a little boy who was at that very moment crying. I voiced the names of all the children I knew, but he said those children were irrelevant to my promise, and the child who was crying was very important to it. Don Juan's statements seemed incongruous. He had said that I had promised something to someone during my childhood, and that the child was crying at that very moment was important. The child who was crying at that very moment was important to my promise. I told him he was not making sense. He calmly repeated that he saw a little boy crying at that moment and that the little boy was hurt. I seriously struggled to fit his statements into some sort of orderly pattern, but I could not relate them to anything I was aware of. So just to stop there for a moment. So this is a situation now that we all encounter and that we've seen so many times over these past few years. Your mind, let's call it your mind, encounters a situation that we just cannot fathom. Are you kidding? You mean there's not contagious diseases? There's no viruses? How can that be? This isn't making any sense. I've lived my whole life believing in such a thing. I've been a virologist for 40 years. I know what isolation means. It means you've isolated the virus. How could I be wrong? So you're struggling to fit these statements into your own sense of reality. I give up, I said, because I can't remember making an important promise to anybody, least of all a child. He squinted his eyes again and said that this particular child who was crying at that precise moment was a child of my childhood. He was a child during my childhood, and he's still crying now, I asked. He is a child crying now, he insisted. Again, how can this be? So we're talking about a world that seemingly doesn't make sense. But I would ask everybody to ask themselves, as if this world seemingly does make sense? Do you realize what you're saying, Don Juan? I do. It doesn't make sense. How can he be a child now if he was one when I was a child myself? He's a child and he's crying now, he said stubbornly. Explain it to me, Don Juan. No, you must explain it to me. So then he goes on. Let me just keep reading this because I think it'll give you the flavor more. He's crying, Don Juan kept on saying in a mesmerizing tone. And he's hugging you now. He's hurt, and he's looking at you. Do you feel his eyes? He's kneeling and hugging you. He's younger than you. He has come running to you, but his arm is broken. Do you feel his arm? That little boy has a nose that looks like a button. Yes, that's a button nose. My ears began to buzz, and I lost the sensation of being at Don Juan's house. The words button nose plunged me at once into a scene out of my childhood. I knew a button nose boy. Don Juan had edged his way into one of the most recondite places of my life. I knew then that the promise he was talking about. I had a sense of elation, of despair, of awe for Don Juan and his splendid maneuver. How in the devil did he know about the button-nosed boy of my childhood? I became so agitated by the memory Don Juan had evoked in me that my power to remember took me back to a time when I was 8 years old. My mother had left 2 years before, and I had spent the most hellish years of my life circulating among my mother's sisters, who served as dutiful mother surrogates and took care of me a couple months at a time. Each of my aunts had a large family, and no matter how careful and protected the aunts were towards me, I had 22 cousins to contend with. Their cruelty was sometimes truly bizarre. I felt then that I was surrounded by enemies, and in the excruciating years that followed, I waged a desperate and sordid war. Finally, through means I still do not know to this day, I succeeded in subduing all my cousins. I was indeed victorious. I had no more competitors who counted. However, I did not know that, nor did I know how to stop my war, which logically was extended to the school grounds. The classrooms of the rural school where I went were mixed, and the first and third grades were separated by a space between the desks. It was there that I met a little boy with a flat nose who was teased with the nickname Button Nose. He was a first grader. I used to pick on him haphazardly, not really intending to, but he seemed to like me in spite of everything I did to him. He used to follow me around and even kept the secrets that I was responsible for some of the pranks that baffled the principal, and yet I still teased him. One day I deliberately toppled over a heavy standing blackboard. It fell on him. The desk in which he was sitting absorbed some of the impact, but still the blow broke his collarbone. He fell down. I helped him up, and I saw the pain and fright in his eyes as he looked at me and held on to me. The shock of seeing him in pain with a mangled arm was more than I could bear. For years, I had viciously battled against my cousins, and I had won. I had vanquished my foes. I felt good and powerful up to the moment when the sight of the button-nosed little boy crying demolished my victories. Right there, I quit the battle. In whatever way I was capable of, I made a resolution not to win ever again. Not to win ever again. I thought his arm would have to be cut off, and I promised that if the little boy was cured, I would never again be victorious. I gave up my victories for him. That was the way that I understood it then. Don Juan had opened a festered sore in my life. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed. A well of unmitigated sadness beckoned me, and I succumbed to it. I felt the weight of my axe on me. The memory of that little button-nosed boy whose name was Joaquin produced in me such a vivid anguish that I wept. I told Don Juan of my sadness for that little boy who never had anything, that little Joaquin who did not have the money to go to a doctor and whose arm never set properly. and all I had to give him were my childish victories. I felt so ashamed. Be in peace, you funny little bird, Don Juan said imperatively. You gave enough. Your victories were strong and they were yours. You gave enough. Now you must change your promise. So when I read that, I can't help but think, was there any times in my life where in order to accomplish something or escape from some situation or not to feel powerful or for any other reason, I made a promise, even not knowing that I was making a promise that is somehow still with me like a kind of a ghost, still crying at my shoulder, telling me not to be successful. The story here is this thing that Castaneda wants more than anything in his life to be successful at that moment, was to be a sorcerer, a man of knowledge, a man who can see. And that was the victory that he was searching for. But as Don Juan saw, he had made a solemn promise, for good reason, obviously, to this little boy who he had unthinkingly and unfeelingly injured, whether intentional or not. He said he did it intentionally, and he injured this little boy, and he promised him that he would never be victorious again. And so I couldn't help but wonder whether that's part of the story of all of our lives. And is there some way we can go back through our lives without having to apprentice with Don Juan, who may not exist, and without taking hallucinogens, which is not something that I'm particularly interested in myself. Not that I have anything against it for people who want to do that, but it's not my path. Is there any way that we can retrieve these memories and find out what kind of promises or solemn pledges we made that may be still impacting our lives? And I think this is similar to this becomes what some people call an almost parasitic mind. So you have this belief based on this trauma or this experience, which you don't even remember exists, but is still has become a major part of how you see the world, and having a major impact on your ability to heal and move forward and even see the things you want to see. And you can see this happening in the people who, no matter what you tell them to do, they simply cannot, or no matter what evidence you give them, they simply cannot understand it, because there's something else in their life which is more important, some promise they've made or some trauma that they're dealing with, that they know that they have to hang on to this promise or this pledge to be part of something, and they cannot change their reality. And that reality then makes them believe there's a virus, which makes them think they need to protect themselves, which makes them think they need to do an injection, which may end up killing them. So if we don't want to do that, we need to investigate what are these kind of mind parasites. What have we ended up believing, which we didn't even remember how we got into this in the first place. So let me leave you with a thought as to how you can unravel this, again, without being an apprentice to a sorcerer, which is probably not possible. And I think the strategy is to see that we have essentially like a dominant mind, which is kind of running our show, which we may not be even aware of, or maybe put it more clearly, we are not aware of. And we have to somehow start the process, which I think is the process, the path of a lifetime. It is the quest for the Holy Grail. Who am I without this overlaid mind impinging on me? So one of the ways, and I'm not saying this is anything like the way, we have to extricate ourselves, confuse this mind. Now, there is a theory that this mind that we erroneously equate as being our true self, it's not. It's an overlay. So we have to confuse it and make it give up. And one of the theories is that this mind has essentially coerced us, or we've settled into fixed patterns which then embed our theory of ourselves even deeper into who we are. So let me offer one simple strategy for extricating yourself from this situation. And that is simply just making the start to doing something, which sometimes is called not doing, which is essentially completely irrational. The theory is this will confuse your mind, and it will give up essentially trying to fit you into the same pattern that you've been in your whole life. So what do I mean by that? Well, you could say walk backwards, which is an interesting experience in itself. But that's like, this is crazy. Why would you do that? Or you could get a pile of rocks and move them to one place and then move them back to another place. So why would you do that? To your mind, it makes no sense. And to your sense of who you are and that you're a person who does things and gets things done and everything is clear and right. And this is like nuts. And so you're confusing the mind in the attempt to essentially loosen its grip on you. You can brush your teeth with the opposite hand. You've probably spent 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 60 years brushing your teeth every day with the same arm. Try it with the other hand. You can do things like talk gibberish. And when I say talk gibberish, I mean real gibberish, not what I would call nonsense, like the way to isolate a virus is to find an isolated virus, or the way to obtain a purified virus is to put it in a centrifuge and get the liquid and call that a purified virus. That's not gibberish. That's your same old mind just talking nonsense, protecting your identity and your sense of self. I mean a sort of total confusion. I mean giving a talk, wearing a Zorro mask, which I will now do for the rest of this time. I mean, if you're a internationally known published psychiatrist who's written best-selling books and has degrees from MIT and medical schools, to make a video about pole dancing, for God's sake, that is somebody who has decided to change their picture and do something which is seemingly incongruous to their normal view of reality, to shake things up and to see at the end of the day who this person really is. And I think if we all start on that path, we may end up finding ourselves a little bit closer to who we really are and who this mind is, this self is, that's actually looking and asking the question, who is this self? And I have a theory, a hypothesis, that will be an important step in the healing that needs to come in this new year.